Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all having a peaceful evening. Tonight I've gathered some of the most intense and mind-blowing stories from Reddit for you to listen to while we watch some chill Minecraft gameplay, so a bit of background. My grandfather passed away about 6 months ago. He was a collector not of expensive cars or jewelry, but of old books, strange antiques, and what most people would call clutter. My sister, Sarah, has always been the golden child. She's materialistic, obsessed with status, and honestly, she never visited our grandfather unless she thought he was going to give her money. This next story is a classic case of be careful who you mess with. I bought my first house about 2 years ago. It's a nice place with a decent-sized backyard. My neighbor, let's call him Mr. Henderson, has lived there for 30 years and thinks he owns the entire street. A month after I moved in, Henderson told me my fence was 6 inches over the property line and that I needed to move it. I looked at the fence. It looked like it had been there for decades. I told him I'd look into it but didn't think it was an issue. He didn't like that. While I was at work, he actually hired someone to tear down that section of the fence. I came home to a pile of wood and Henderson smirking from his porch. I didn't yell, I didn't get mad, I just called a professional surveyor. The surveyor spent the whole day measuring. When he was done, he called me over with a confused look. It turns out Henderson was right. The property line was off, but not in the way he thought. It turns out Henderson's entire driveway and half of his expensive detached garage were actually built on my property. The previous owner of my house was a nice old lady who just let him do it, but the legal boundary was very clear. I walked over to Henderson with the survey map. His face went from smug to ghostly white. I told him, "You were right, we should definitely respect the property lines. You have 30 days to remove your garage from my land, or I'll have it demolished." He tried to apologize. He offered me money. He even tried to bake me cookies. I told him I wasn't interested. I made him pay to rebuild my fence, the original one he tore down, exactly on the correct line, and I ended up selling him an easement for his driveway for a ridiculous monthly fee. Now every time he sees me, he looks at the ground and scurries inside. This one is a little different. It's not a revenge story, it's just weird. I used to work for a large insurance company in a massive skyscraper. My shift was 4 p.m. to midnight, so for the last few hours, the building was mostly empty. One night, around 11 p.m., I was heading to the break room for some coffee. To get there, I had to pass the archives room, a huge glass-walled room filled with filing cabinets. As I walked past, I saw a woman sitting at one of the desks inside. She was wearing a bright yellow dress, which stood out because everyone else wore grey or blue suits. She was typing furiously on an old-school typewriter. Click, 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 ding. I thought it was weird because we hadn't used typewriters in 20 years. I waved, but she didn't look up. The next night, same thing. 11 p.m., bright yellow dress, typewriter. I mentioned it to the security guard, Dave, on my way out. I said, "Who's the lady in the yellow dress in archives? She's a hard worker." Dave stopped dead. He pulled up the security footage from the archives for 11 p.m. The room was completely empty. I watched the screen. I saw myself walk past the glass, look inside, and wave at nothing. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. Dave zoomed in on the desk where I saw her. There was no typewriter there, but on the desk, a stack of papers was vibrating, as if someone was hitting keys nearby. I quit that job a week later. I don't care how much they pay. I'm not sharing an office with a ghost who has a deadline. This story comes from a guy who had to deal with the ultimate bridezilla, his own sister. My sister Emily got married last summer. She wanted a royal wedding on a McDonald's budget, and she expected the whole family to fund it. She asked me to be the photographer because I have a nice camera. I do photography as a side business, and I usually charge $3,000 for weddings. I told her I'd do it for free as a wedding gift. Big mistake. During the wedding, Emily was a nightmare. She insulted the caterers, made her bridesmaids cry, and at one point, she screamed at me because the lighting was too natural. At the reception, she demanded I stay until 2 a.m. to take photos of people dancing. I was exhausted and told her I was leaving at midnight. She threw a glass of wine at me. It missed, but it hit my $2,000 lens. I didn't say a word. I packed my gear and left. The next day, she started texting me every hour. "Where are the photos? Send me the link." I waited until she was on her honeymoon. I sent her an email. I told her that due to the hostile work environment and the damage to my equipment, I wouldn't be editing the photos. I told her she could have the raw files, but only if she paid my full $3,000 fee, plus $500 for the lens repair. She went nuclear. My parents called me, my aunts called me. I didn't budge. I told them, if I'm a professional, pay me like one. If I'm family, treat me like family. You can't have both. She ended up paying after 3 months because her husband's family was dying to see the pictures. I donated the $3,000 to a charity she hates and sent her the receipt. In his will, he left his house and the contents of the study to be split between us. Sarah immediately jumped on this. She showed up at the house with a moving truck before the funeral was even over. She claimed that since she was the oldest, she got first pick. She looked at the study, which was filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and old wooden crates. She point-blank told me, "I'm taking the house and the furniture. You can have the books and the old papers in the crates. It's all just dusty trash anyway." I asked her if she was sure. I even offered to split the house value. She laughed and said, "No, I want the property. You take the junk." We signed the paperwork, and she officially took ownership of the house. Here's the thing Sarah didn't know. Our grandfather wasn't just a collector of books. He was a specialized collector of first edition classic literature. I spent the next 3 months going through those dusty crates. In the first one alone, I found a near-pristine first edition of The Great Gatsby. In another, a signed copy of The Hobbit. I had an appraiser come out, and just the first half of the collection was valued at over $450,000. But that wasn't even the best part. In the very last crate, buried under some old newspapers, I found a small metal tin. Inside were the deeds to 2 plots of land in a developing part of the city that he'd bought in the 70s and forgotten about. Those plots are now worth nearly $1 million. Sarah, meanwhile, found out that the house she was so desperate to keep had a crumbling foundation and a massive black mold problem that the insurance wouldn't cover. It's going to cost her more to fix it than the house is worth. She called me screaming when she saw a photo of one of the books I sold at auction. She called me a thief and said I tricked her. I just reminded her of what she said. It's all just dusty trash, right? I'm currently sitting in my new apartment, debt-free, while she's trying to figure out how to pay for a new roof. Don't be greedy, folks. This next story is a long one, so get comfortable. It's a story about how I thought I was living a fairy tale for 7 years, only to realize I was actually the victim of one of the most calculated long-con scams I've ever heard of. I met my ex-wife, Claire, when we were both 25. I was an up-and-coming software engineer and she was a freelance graphic designer. From the moment we met, everything felt perfect, too perfect. She liked everything I liked. She was supportive of my long hours at work. She was the person who encouraged me to start my own tech consulting firm. When my firm took off and I started making significant money, Claire was the one who suggested we keep our finances organized. She offered to handle the bills, the mortgage, and our investment portfolios so I could focus on growing the business. I trusted her completely. I mean, why wouldn't I? She was my wife, my best friend, my soulmate. For 7 years, every time I asked how our savings were doing, she'd pull up a spreadsheet or show me a balance on a banking app. The numbers always looked great. We were millionaires on paper, as she used to say. We lived in a beautiful house, took 2 luxury vacations a year, and I felt like I had won at life. The first crack in the armor appeared about 6 months ago. I was at work, and my business credit card was declined at a lunch meeting. I thought it was just a glitch, so I called the bank. The representative told me the account had been closed due to suspicious activity and lack of funds. I went home and asked Claire about it. She laughed it off, saying she'd moved the money to a high-yield savings account because the interest rates were better. She showed me a transfer confirmation on her phone. I felt stupid for even doubting her. I kissed her, apologized, and went back to work. But a week later, I got a letter in the mail addressed to current resident. It was an eviction notice, not for my office, but for our house. The letter stated that the mortgage hadn't been paid in over 14 months and the house was in foreclosure. I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't wait for Claire to get home. I went to her home office and started looking through her desk. I'd never snooped before, but something in my gut was screaming. I found a locked drawer. I'm ashamed to admit I used a screwdriver to pry it open, but what I found inside changed my life forever. It wasn't just one bank statement, it was dozens. Claire hadn't been paying the bills. She hadn't been investing our money. She had been funneling every single cent from our joint accounts into a private offshore account in her name only. But that wasn't the worst part. I found a second passport. It was Claire's photo, but the name was different. Elena Markov. There were also flight tickets to a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with ours. The flight was scheduled for 2 weeks from that day. I sat on the floor of that office for 3 hours, just staring at the floor. I realized that my entire marriage, the vacations, the support, the I love yous, was just a long-term job for her. She was waiting for my business to hit a certain valuation, and then she was going to disappear with everything. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. If she knew I knew, she'd leave that night, and I'd never see a penny of that money again. So I did something that was the hardest thing I've ever done. I acted like everything was fine. When she came home, I kissed her. We had dinner. We talked about where we should go for our 10th anniversary. Inside, I was dying, but outside, I was a stone. The next morning, I went to a private investigator and a forensic accountant. I told them everything. I gave them the names from the fake passport. The PI found out that Clea, or Elena, was part of a professional marriage scam ring. She had done this twice before in Europe. She finds high-earning professionals, manages their money, and vanishes after 5 to 8 years. I was just her latest project. But she made one mistake. She didn't realize that as a software engineer, I had installed a keylogger on the Home Office computer years ago, purely for my own security. I had never used it on her because I trusted her. I went into the logs. I found the password to her secret offshore account. I saw the balance, $2.4 million, my money, my hard work. I spent the next 10 days working with my lawyer and a cybersecurity expert. We didn't just want to take the money back. I wanted her to feel exactly what I felt. The day before her secret flight, I told her I had a surprise. I told her I booked us a stay at a fancy hotel downtown to celebrate a big new contract I'd signed. She was glowing, probably thinking she was getting one last treat before she ditched me. We got to the hotel, and I told her I'd forgotten something in the car. I told her to go up to the room and wait for me. She went up, but when she opened the door, it wasn't a romantic suite. Inside the room were 2 police officers, my lawyer, and the forensic accountant. On the bed was her fake passport and her one-way ticket. I walked in a few minutes later. The look of pure, cold calculation on her face was something I'll never forget. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked at me and said, "You were smarter than the others, I'll give you that." My lawyer informed her that we had already legally frozen the offshore account and were in the process of transferring the funds back to my name. Because she had committed identity fraud and wire fraud, she wasn't just losing the money, she was going to prison. But here's the kicker. My lawyer told her that if she signed over her rights to everything, the house, which I ended up saving with the recovered money, her car, and a full confession, I wouldn't press charges for the identity theft, only the financial fraud, which would mean a shorter sentence. She signed it, she had no choice. As she was being led away in handcuffs, I leaned in and whispered, "I actually did love you, Elena. That was the only thing in this house that wasn't a scam." It's been 6 months now. The divorce is final. I lost a lot of time, and I have a hard time trusting people now. I still live in that house, but I've repainted every single room. I replaced all the furniture. Sometimes I sit in my office with a new, very secure desk, and I wonder if anything she ever said was true. But then I look at my bank balance, and I realize that the best revenge isn't just getting your money back. It's watching the person who tried to destroy you realize they walked right into your trap. She's currently serving time, and I'm back to running my business. I'm single, I'm careful, and I handle my own spreadsheets now. So to anyone listening, trust your partner, but keep an eye on your own accounts. Because sometimes the person sleeping next to you isn't a spouse, they're a professional. This next one is for everyone who has ever had a boss who thought they knew more about your job than you do. This is a story of malicious compliance at its finest. I worked as a senior systems administrator for a mid-sized logistics company for about 12 years. I was the guy who built their entire server infrastructure from the ground up. I knew every line of code, every weird glitch in the database, and every reason why the servers would occasionally scream at 3 a.m. I was paid well, but I earned every penny because without me, the company's shipping trackers simply wouldn't work. Enter Kevin. Kevin was a fresh MBA graduate who was hired as the new director of efficiency. He wore suits that cost more than my car and had never seen a server rack in his life. On his second day, he called me into his office. He looked at my salary on his tablet and frowned. He told me that my role was redundant and that automation should be doing 90% of my work. He didn't understand that I was the one who wrote the automation scripts. He told me I needed to document everything I do in a master manual over the next month so they could hand my tasks over to a cheaper, junior-level team in another country. I tried to explain. I told him, "Kevin, this system is held together by custom patches. It's not just a manual, it's a living organism." He held up a hand and said, "I don't need tech babble, I need efficiency. Write the manual or we'll find someone who can." So I decided to follow his instructions to the absolute letter. I spent the next 4 years. Sorry, it felt like 4 years, but it was 4 weeks, writing the most technically accurate yet completely useless manual in history. I documented every command, but I didn't explain why or when to use them. I didn't mention the 3 a.m. glitch, or how the database would crash if the backup script ran 5 seconds too late. On my last day, Kevin gave me a smug smile and handed me my severance package. He told me, "See, we didn't need you after all. The junior team says the manual is comprehensive." I walked out, went home, and turned off my phone. I didn't even look at a computer for 2 weeks. I went camping in a place with 0 cell service. When I finally drove back into range, my phone literally exploded. I had 142 missed calls and over 300 text messages. Most were from Kevin, and they transitioned from "Hey, quick question" to "Urgent, caller me now" to "I will sue you if you don't answer." Apparently 3 days after I left, the main database suffered a routine deadlock. This happened once a month. In the manual I'd written, in case of a deadlock, restart the SQL service. What I didn't write was that you had to manually clear the cache before restarting, or the entire file system would corrupt itself. The junior team followed the manual. They restarted the service. The system corrupted. Then they tried to restore from backups, but because they didn't know the custom encryption keys, which were stored in a secure physical vault I'd mentioned in the manual as Security Protocol A1, they couldn't access the backups. The company was paralyzed. No trucks could leave the warehouse because the tracking system was dark. They were losing roughly $250,000 a day in late fees and lost business. I didn't call Kevin back. I called the CEO directly. The CEO was a reasonable guy who had always liked me. I told him I was fired because my role was redundant. "If you want me to fix this, I'm no longer an employee. I'm a private consultant." The CEO asked for my rate. I told him $5,000 for the initial consultation, plus $500 an hour, with a minimum of 40 hours paid up front. Also, Kevin needs to be the one to hand-deliver the check to my house. The CEO didn't even argue. He was desperate. 2 hours later, a very humiliated Kevin pulled into my driveway. He didn't look at me. He just handed me the check and stayed in his car. I went into the office, sat down at my old desk, and fixed the unfixable corruption in about 45 minutes. It was just a matter of inputting the encryption key and running a recovery script I'd written 5 years ago. I spent the rest of the 40 hours I'd been paid for just sitting in the break room, drinking their expensive coffee and reading a book. When the CEO asked if I wanted my old job back with a raise, I said, "No thanks, I like being a consultant." Kevin was fired a week later. The company now pays me a $5,000 monthly retainer just to be available if things go wrong. I work maybe 2 hours a month for them from my living room while I play video games. The moral of the story: if you want to fire the guy who built the foundation, make sure you know how to lay bricks first. This last story for tonight is a bit shorter, but it's one that always gives me the chills. It's a true story from a woman who realized that sometimes your own home isn't as safe as you think. My husband Mark works a night shift at a hospital. He usually gets home around 7:30 a.m. just as I'm waking up for work. Our routine is always the same. I hear the garage door open, I hear him kick his boots off in the mudroom, and then he comes into the bedroom to kiss me goodbye before I head out. One Tuesday morning, I heard the garage door rumble. I glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m., a little early but not unusual. I stayed under the covers, feeling that morning grogginess. I heard the heavy thump-thump of his boots hitting the floor in the mudroom. I heard the door to the kitchen creak open. Then, I heard him walking down the hallway toward the bedroom. But as the footsteps got closer, I realized something felt wrong. Mark has a very distinct walk. He has a slight limp in his left leg from an old football injury, so his footsteps have a heavy light rhythm. These footsteps were perfectly even. Thump, 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 thump. The bedroom door opened slowly. I kept my back to the door, pretending to still be asleep. I expected to feel the bed sink as he sat down, or to hear him whisper, "Good morning." Instead, there was just silence. Total, absolute silence. I could feel someone standing right behind me looking at me. The air in the room felt cold. I waited for a few seconds, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I whispered, "Mark, you're early." No response. I turned over quickly, ready to see him standing there, but the room was empty. The door was wide open, but there was nobody in the hallway. I jumped out of bed and ran to the kitchen. "Mark," I called out. Nothing. I checked the mudroom. His boots weren't there. I looked at the garage. It was empty. The door was closed and locked. I checked the security system. It showed that the garage door had never been opened that morning. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. I sat at the kitchen table, shaking, and called Mark. He answered on the second ring. He was still at the hospital. A patient had had an emergency, and he was going to be 2 hours late. I told him what happened, and he tried to convince me I was just dreaming. But I know what I heard. I heard the garage, I heard the boots, I heard the door. The worst part happened a week later. I was cleaning under the bed, and I found a small, handwritten note tucked under the frame, right where my head usually is. It just said, "You have a very peaceful sleep." We moved out that month. I don't know who or what was in that house, and I don't know how they got in without triggering the alarm. But every morning now, I wait until I actually see Mark's face before I feel safe enough to get out of bed. This next story is a long one, so grab a snack and settle in. It's a saga of petty power, environmental destruction, and the kind of legal revenge that only happens once in a lifetime. About 3 years ago, my wife and I bought our forever home. It was a beautiful 1920s craftsman-style house on a large corner lot. The crown jewel of the property was a massive, majestic white oak tree in the backyard. The local arborist estimated it was at least 110 years old. It was huge, providing shade for the whole house and keeping our AC bills low in the summer. It was the reason we bought the house. The neighborhood was governed by an HOA, Homeowners Association. We knew that going in, but the rules seemed reasonable at first. Keep your grass cut, don't park boats on the lawn, standard stuff. But we didn't count on Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was the HOA president, and she lived directly behind us. She was a woman who clearly had too much time on her hands and a deep-seated need to control everything within a 5-block radius. She spent her mornings walking the neighborhood with a clipboard and a literal ruler to measure people's grass. From the day we moved in, she hated our tree. Why? Because during the fall, some of the leaves would blow over the fence and land on her award-winning, putting green-style lawn. She actually knocked on our door a week after we moved in and asked when we were planning to remove that messy eyesore. I laughed, thinking she was joking. I told her, "That tree is older than this entire neighborhood, Mrs. Gable. It's staying right where it is." She didn't laugh back. She just narrowed her eyes, scribbled something on her clipboard, and walked away. Over the next 6 months, the harassment started. We began getting notice of violation letters in the mail. Violation 1, excessive debris leaves in the common area, fined $50. Violation 2, unapproved wildlife attractant. She claimed the bird feeder in the tree was a nuisance. Violation 3, tree limbs overhanging a neighbor's property. I followed the law. I hired a professional, certified arborist to trim the branches that crossed the property line. In our state, a neighbor has the right to trim branches over their property, but only if it doesn't harm the health of the tree. My arborist was very careful. He gave me a signed report saying the tree was in perfect health. I thought that was the end of it, but Mrs. Gable was playing a much dirtier game. One weekend, my wife and I went away for a short vacation to celebrate our anniversary. We were gone for 3 days. When we pulled into our driveway on Sunday evening, I felt a knot in my stomach. The backyard looked different, empty. I ran to the back and I almost collapsed. Our 110-year-old oak tree was gone. Not just trimmed, gone. It had been cut down to a stump about 3 feet high. The wood was already hauled away. The ground was covered in sawdust. I was shaking with rage. I looked over the fence and there was Mrs. Gable, standing on her back porch with a glass of lemonade, watching me. She actually had the audacity to wave and say, "It looks much cleaner now, doesn't it?" The HOA board approved an emergency removal because the tree was unstable and presented a danger to the community. I didn't say a word to her. If I had, I probably would have ended up in jail. I went inside, called the police, and called my lawyer. The police arrived, and Mrs. Gable showed them a permit for emergency removal, signed by her as the HOA president. The police said that since it was an HOA matter and she had paperwork, it was a civil issue, not a criminal one. They couldn't arrest her. But they didn't know about tree law. You see, in many states, trees are treated as extremely valuable property, and cutting down a century-old hardwood without the owner's permission is a massive legal mistake. My lawyer was a shark. He specialized in property disputes. The first thing we did was look into that emergency board meeting. It turns out there never was one. Mrs. Gable had forged the signatures of the other 2 board members, 2 elderly men who barely knew what day it was. Then we hired a specialized forensic arborist. This guy was like a CSI agent for plants. He examined the stump and the surrounding soil. He found 2 things that sealed Mrs. Gable's fate. First, the tree was perfectly healthy. There was 0 evidence of rot or instability. Second, he found high concentrations of a very specific, industrial-strength herbicide around the roots. Mrs. Gable hadn't just cut it down. She had been poisoning it for months to make it look like it was dying. We sued Mrs. Gable personally, and we sued the HOA. Here's the thing about old trees. You can't just go to Home Depot and buy a 100-year-old white oak. To replace a tree of that size, you have to factor in the cost of the tree itself, the specialized equipment to transport a massive adult tree, the labor, and the loss of enjoyment of the property. The appraisal for the tree came back at $180,000. But wait, it gets better. In our state, if you can prove willful and malicious destruction of timber, you are entitled to treble damages. That means triple the amount. $180,000 times 3 is $540,000. When the lawsuit hit, the HOA insurance company immediately panicked. They realized Mrs. Gable had acted outside of her authority and had committed fraud by forging board signatures. They dropped her coverage and refused to defend her. Mrs. Gable was on her own. The trial was short. My lawyer presented the arborist's report, the fake meeting notes, and a video from my neighbor's Ring camera that showed the tree removal company arriving the moment we left for our vacation. Mrs. Gable had literally timed it. The judge was a tree lover. He was disgusted. In his closing remarks, he told Mrs. Gable that her obsession with a perfect lawn had led her to destroy a living piece of history. The final judgment was for $620,000, including legal fees and emotional distress. Mrs. Gable didn't have $620,000 in cash. Most of her wealth was tied up in her house, the house with the perfect lawn. To pay the judgment, she was forced to sell. But because the neighborhood now knew she was a fraud and a nightmare, and because the HOA was in shambles because of her, the property value had dipped. I ended up having a friend buy the house through an LLC. We didn't want to live in it, but we wanted to control the land. Today, Mrs. Gable lives in a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town with no trees and no lawns. She's broke, and she's banned from ever serving on a housing board again. As for our backyard, we used a portion of the settlement to plant 3 beautiful, high-quality saplings. They aren't 100 years old yet, but they're growing. And the best part, we used the rest of the money to pay off our mortgage completely. Every time I look out my back window, I don't see Mrs. Gable. I just see a wide-open view, a lot of sun, and the stump of the old oak, which I've turned into a beautiful garden table. It's a reminder that sometimes, the messy eyesore is the person with the clipboard, not the tree. This final story for tonight is a long one, and it's a perfect example of why you should always do your homework before you start a war with your neighbors. I live in a very old, very quiet coastal town, the kind of place where people move to retire and listen to the waves. My house is a small 19th century cottage that I've spent 10 years restoring. Next door to me was a beautiful, massive Victorian mansion. For years, it was owned by a sweet old professor who kept his garden perfect and never made a sound. When the professor passed away, the house was sold to a guy we'll call Justin. Justin was in his late 20s, clearly had some family money, and wore sunglasses indoors. He didn't move into the mansion. Instead, he spent 3 months doing renovations. I use that term lightly because what he was actually doing was gutting the interior to cram in as many bedrooms as possible. I found out his plan a month later when a giant sign went up in front of the house. The Gatsby Experience, Luxury Group Stays. Justin had turned this historic, 6-bedroom family home into a 15-bedroom boutique hostel that he listed on every vacation rental site imaginable. And he wasn't renting to families. He was renting to bachelor parties, corporate retreats, and influencers. Suddenly, my quiet street was filled with SUVs blocking my driveway, screaming people in the backyard at 3 a.m., and mountains of trash that the local seagulls would tear apart. I tried to talk to Justin. I walked over one afternoon and said, "Hey man, I know you're trying to run a business, but this is a residential zone. The noise is constant, and your guests are literally walking through my garden to get to the beach." Justin didn't even look up from his phone. He just said, "Look, Grandpa, it's a free country. The house is mine, I can do what I want. If you don't like the noise, buy some earplugs. Or better yet, move to a nursing home." That was his first mistake. He assumed I was just some grumpy old man who didn't know how the world worked. What he didn't know is that I am a retired city planner with a specialty in historical preservation. I didn't call the police. The police in our town are busy and usually just give a noise warning that Justin would ignore. I went to the town hall. I spent 3 days in the basement archives, digging through the original deeds and the historical registry of the town, and that's when I found the golden ticket. You see, Justin's mansion wasn't just old, it was a Tier 1 registered landmark. Back in the 1950s, the previous owners had signed a permanent covenant with the State Historical Society to get a massive tax break. The terms of that covenant were very specific. The interior floor plan of the house could never be altered. The property could only be used as a single-family residence. Any structural changes required a 12-month approval process from a board of architects. Justin had ignored all of this. He had torn down walls, added bathrooms, and converted the attic, all without a single historical permit. But I didn't stop there. I looked into his Gatsby Experience business. To run a hostel or hotel in our town, you need a high-capacity fire safety certificate. Because he had crammed 15 bedrooms into a wooden Victorian house with only 2 staircases, he was essentially running a giant fire trap. I didn't send a letter to Justin. I sent a 40-page report, complete with photos of his renovations and his AIB listings, to 3 different places: the State Historical Society, the City Building Inspector, and the State Fire Marshal. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee when the show started. A fleet of black SUVs and city vans pulled up in front of Justin's mansion. I saw the fire marshal, the building inspector, and 2 representatives from the Historical Society step out. Justin came to the door, looking confused and annoyed. He tried his "it's a free country" speech on the fire marshal. It didn't work. The fire marshal declared the building unfit for human habitation, on the spot due to the illegal room partitions blocking fire exits. They forced every guest to evacuate immediately. I watched 25 confused frat bros and influencers dragging their suitcases out onto the sidewalk at noon. Then the Historical Society stepped in. They informed Justin that because he had violated the Tier 1 covenant, he was being sued for restoration damages. In our state, if you destroy a historical landmark's interior, you are legally required to restore it to its exact original 1890s floor plan using period-accurate materials. The estimated cost to unfuck the house, roughly $1.2 million. And because he had violated the covenant, the state revoked his tax-exempt status retroactively for the last 3 years. He owed the town $80,000 in back taxes, due immediately. Justin's Gatsby dream turned into a nightmare in less than an hour. He tried to fight it in court, but you can't argue with a deed from 1895. He had no permits, no leg to stand on, and no sympathy from the judge. He ended up going bankrupt. He couldn't afford the restoration, and he couldn't sell the house because it had a notice of violation, lien on it, that made it unmarketable. The bank foreclosed on the mansion. A local historical trust bought it at auction for a fraction of its value. They are currently restoring it back into a museum and a library. Justin is gone. Last I heard, he's living in a small apartment and working for a car rental company. Now my street is quiet again. The only sound I hear at 3 a.m. is the ocean. Sometimes I look over at the mansion and I think about Justin's words. The house is mine. I can do what I want. He was right about one thing. It is a free country. You're free to be as arrogant as you want, as long as you're prepared to pay the price when the bill comes due. And in this town, we have a very long memory.